Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Rational Female Podcast. And today we have a great guest. His name is Andrew, and he's going to talk to us today about the issues that he sees facing men and boys. And I'm so pleased to have him on. So, to kick us off, please tell me about your background and your involvement in men's advocacy.
Hey everyone, I'm from Missouri, in the Midwest of the United States. I attended the University of Missouri in Columbia, and I got degrees in political science and business administration management. Originally, I was studying economics and wanted to be a lawyer. Then I wanted to work at the State Department, but things have changed with the federal government and just observing the job market these days. So right now I'm working in the construction related industry, doing equipment rentals. But I've been involved in men's issues, at least on my own, directly online since I was a teenager, at least in high school. Whether it be on Reddit slash such as r/left wing male advocates, which is a really good forum, and just on YouTube comment sections. And I'm a regular attender of the National Coalition for Men Chicago chapter meetings led by Tim Goldich. Should check out their YouTube channel, NCFM. And I'm glad to be here. Been watching Zarina's videos for quite a while, and really great in letting people of all sorts of opinions and backgrounds have their voice, which is a rare thing these days with cancel culture and the ideological capture of gender issues by the mainstream feminist bureaucracy. So glad to be here. A lot of issues I'd like to cover.
Yeah, Tim is a regular on this channel. He is a great guy. So, why don't you tell us a bit about the NCFM? That stands for National Coalition for Men, and that's based in the US, right? Tell me about a bit about them and their work.
National Coalition for Men has existed since the 1970s, when the second wave feminist movement really got going. It was sort of a counterpart to that, in that people wanted to, where society was changing a lot in the 60s and 70s, of course, with the sexual revolution and gender roles. And National Coalition for Men was a part of the men's movement at that time that wanted to bring the male perspective, the male side of equality. Like feminism was advocating so much for women and women's issues, and they were filling out the void of, well, where do men fit into this? What is their role in society now that things are changing from traditional gender roles? And at first, I believe they were more supportive of feminism, more along the side of feminism. But as things went along, they noticed that the feminist movement had many flaws in it, such as Warren Farrell, who was not one of the founders, but a prominent member in its early years in the 80s, pointing out how feminists in that movement would advocate for mothers and women over their own children, such as in family court systems, that the feminist movement would support decisions by courts that would advantage women over men in the court system, even when they was for the benefit of the child. So things like that, and advocating for policies that discriminate against men, and the many flaws in some laws, such as the Violence Against Women Act, whenever it was initially passed in the United States in the 90s, ignoring male victims of domestic violence and sexual assault, especially in statistics, and there not being shelters for them. They started noticing that and pointing that out, and they've taken a lot of good actions. A lot of what they've done is suing the Selective Services in the United States that requires only men to sign up for conscription in case there's a draft for war. They want to make sure that women are added on to that just as much as men, equal responsibility for equal rights. And they also have made lawsuits in California to ensure that men have domestic violence shelters as well for themselves, because California passed a law years ago where only women got funding for domestic violence shelters, and they were sued by a prominent member who was a lawyer from Southern California. And now California law requires that men receive equal treatment to women whenever it comes to domestic violence shelter access and funding. So had quite a bit of victories there, and they have quite a bit of funding. They've sort of slowed down in recent years and been struggling. They were labeled a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center, which I believe is completely wrong in every way, shape, and form. They are not a hate group. They believe in equality. And in fact, the last meeting I was in, they had two women who were taking up most of the speaking time who were very supportive of the group, talking about fathers' rights and having a fathers' rights conference in Arkansas. So they're inclusive of women. They, in fact, want more women in the group. And all they've shouted out for is equality. And the SPLC has labeled them a hate group just because they don't follow the feminist dogma. They've said how the NCFM nitpicks statistics, which I mean isn't true in any ways. Feminist movements nitpick a lot of statistics all the time. And even if that were true, just because an organization is nitpicking statistics doesn't mean they're a male supremacist group or a hate group. So they're using their bureaucratic power to cancel any discussion that tries to bring the men's and boys' side to issue, points out inequality and discrimination against men and boys. So it's a great organization. I think it needs some fresh blood, some new members who are younger, and more social media advocacy. They do have a website, ncfm.org, and they do have a YouTube channel with a podcast. They have many great articles on there to cover its history and what they've been doing, including working with the several organizations to make sure that the selective service system isn't male only. So yeah, great group of people to take action and fundraise money. And they have the prominence of great members such as Tim Goldich, Warren Farrell in the past, and its current president Harry Crouch. So definitely recommend to anybody watching this.
Yeah, so I've just put the link to NCFM on the screen, and I've been to a couple of meetings myself. So yeah, I think it's absolutely crucial and vital that we have these men's advocacy groups. Now, I would like to say one thing on women being conscripted. Personally, I don't support this, and I don't think this should be allowed because women are genuinely physically not as strong as men. I actually think having women in the armed forces on the front line, maybe doing other things, but I don't think women should be fighting on the front line. So that's something I personally disagree with. I think as well with men's equality with men's equality groups in general, I think we should be striving for equality of opportunity, but not necessarily equal outcomes, because I think we have to maintain as well that men and women are physically different. And I think that's why, for example, one of the issues that I take with feminism, the desire to say that men and women are the same and gender is a social construct. So what's your general view on women being conscripted, and also where the kind of general men's movement is going with all this stuff?
I've thought a lot about that issue for many years now. And I personally think the conscription should be eliminated completely, of course. But the reason why they are, trying to make conscription gender neutral is because, it's much easier to argue for gender equality based on existing law, like the 14th Amendment in the United States, which guarantees equality under the law, than it is to eliminate the selective service system as a whole. And I do think that it is okay to draft women in war because, there's many roles they can serve that aren't in the front lines. And there's definitely a lot of overlap where there are women who are definitely physically fit and strong enough to serve in combat roles. And the United States has allowed women to serve in combat roles since around 2014 in Obama's second term. So the argument that they can't be drafted is very no longer has any standing under U.S. law like it used to beforehand, where the Supreme Court would dismiss adding women to selective service system because the U.S. military banned them from serving in combat roles. But of course, there's many roles, of course, that people can take in war, and like I think it's very wrong. Conscription is forcing someone to fight, die, and kill against their will, and risk injury and watching other people die. And of course, the time used up for that experience, just to fight in a war, and to only delegate that to one gender just because they happen to be born male is just incredibly immoral to me. And ideally, yeah, there should be no conscription. But if I had to choose between male only conscription or gender neutral conscription, I would choose gender neutral conscription because it's what's morally right. Of course, feminists will argue how there are women who are single mothers who do more child caretaking, take care of their parents. But not all women do that. There's intersectionality. There's men who are single fathers. Not intersectionality, but overlap. And many exceptions to what the average is. Men who do most of the child caretaking, men who are home caretakers for their parents, their elderly parents, for their primary caretakers of their children, stay-at-home dads, and plenty of women who don't have children to take care of, and definitely have the time and energy to serve in the armed forces. So, yeah, I think that's probably the biggest violation of men's rights, men's equality, is conscription, which is in over 60 countries around the world. And either it has to be eliminated or women have to be added to it. Preferably, I think the best course of action is eliminating it. But in areas where it'd be very difficult to, it should be made gender neutral. So over 60 countries have male-only conscription in some way, shape, or form. And the United Nations, which is all about gender equality, doesn't criticize it. And you see the result of that conscription: lost time for young men having to spend time that they could be spending towards their careers. And men, of course, when there is a war like in Ukraine and Russia right now, hundreds of thousands of young men have died just for being born male, even banned from leaving Ukraine. And if they do leave Ukraine into the European Union, they're denied the benefits that women do who escape the country. And men being kidnapped all the time. They're even thinking about conscripting boys, 17, 16 years old, I've seen on forums. Yeah, it's just evil. It's just wrong whenever feminists are advocating for something that is so small, such as, the temperature in office buildings for men versus women, when there's men being conscripted to fight, die, and kill in war right now. And the UN, all these gender equality feminist organizations aren't calling it out. And yeah, it just brings a sickening feeling to my gut. So there's a lot more issues than just conscription, but I think conscription of men only is the pinnacle of inequality against men and boys. It's the gravest violation of our rights worldwide.
I agree with you that conscription should be banned. I think that's the best course of action, really. And I think that the feminists will generally say things like, oh, it's men killing men sending men to fight and die. And it's very interesting how they will lobby for women to have certain rights that men had, but not for other rights.
Yeah.
Rights. They'll lobby for women to do certain things men did, but then they won't lobby for women to be drafted, which is very interesting. So, for example, they say, oh, women can do anything men can do, but they can't do that. So, which is it? Is it men and women are actually biologically different, or is it men and women should be able to do exactly the same thing? So that's a big inconsistency with feminism. So, yeah, this brings me to my next question then. So what's, aside from conscription, as you mentioned, and what are some of the worst issues facing men and boys in the West right now?
Yeah, there's a lot to cover. Just one more thing on the conscription thing. Whenever women argue that it's men who are drafting men into war, well, that's inherently flawed. I mean, you could apply that based on race. Like, most military leaders, political leaders in the United States are white, and yet African Americans, Native Americans, Mestizo Americans like myself were drafted into war. So, like, and women have had voting power since, across the country since 1920. So they vote for, just like men vote for leaders who draft men into war. So to say that just because the majority of leaders in the world are male, it doesn't mean that men are any more responsible. Just because you share the same sex or race as somebody who is in the leadership doesn't mean you're any more obligated than a person who's of a different race or sex to fight in the war. So, that's something I do bring up a lot, is I compare feminist logic and apply it to race and ethnicity, which is something I cover a lot in social justice, because it really is a good, easy critique of what they do. Like, what if you apply that logic based on someone's ancestry, race, or ethnicity, or other characteristic that they don't control, sexual orientation, skin color, eye color, stuff like that? It's really no different. But yeah, back to some of the main points. There's so much to cover. Other than conscription, there's blatant discrimination, which is in the law, de facto and de jure discrimination. And there's discrimination in how laws are applied by judges and courts and juries, bureaucrats. And then of course there's social norms and biases everywhere. Some of the other blatant ones include retirement ages being later for men than women in dozens of countries, despite men having shorter life expectancies due to biological reasons. There's also worker protections, where in some countries like China, women don't have to are banned from working overnight shifts or working overtime. They get special protections at work that men don't. And that's kind of a paternalistic perspective. And some women will say that it's a form of, sexism against women somehow because it's paternalistic, but still it advantages women over men. And then there's other issues like judicial corporal punishment. That's a big one that's undercovered. In about 15 countries, there's only judicial corporal punishment against men and boys. And that's where things like caning, whipping, beating as punishment for a crime is legal and used by the force of government to only apply to men and or boys in several countries, from the Middle East to Malaysia, Singapore, and even the Caribbean. And there's even at least a couple of countries where only boys, not even men, but only boys who are minors who are subject to being whipped or caned, whereas girls aren't, even though, like I've said before, there's a lot of overlap where a man or boy can be significantly weaker or smaller, even without a disability, than a woman or girl. So, like, for example, me personally, part of the reason I got so much into men's issues was because I was very small for my age and height and weight. I had human growth hormone deficiency as a child, and I got treated for it with human growth hormone treatment, which is why I'm the height and weight I am now. But I was smaller and shorter and weaker than literally all the girls in my class up until around sometime in freshman year of high school. And even then, it wasn't until I was about 16 or 17 that I got to a normal height that I am now, in a relatively normal weight. So I was much weaker and smaller than most girls in my class, almost all of them, even up until, beginning of high school. So that really changed my perspective on stereotypes of weakness and, of power, because I never felt empowered as a man because of my physical strength or my height. I was always the smallest one physically. So, imagine me, if I was a young boy, I could have been subject to that judicial corporal punishment, whereas a girl who committed the same or even a worse crime would be exempt just because she's female, even though she may be stronger than I am and her body may be more able to handle caning or whipping, which is wrong. I think that should be illegal all across the board. But the fact that it's only applied to men and or boys in the UN and other organizations aren't pointing that out is extremely wrong. Those things aren't very widespread, but they show like how far things are for discrimination against men that people don't know about. Most people don't even know about this stuff. Retirement ages, blatant discrimination against men. Meanwhile, they talk about how women have fewer rights than men somehow in the United States, whenever that's definitely not true. And in the European Union and the West as a whole, there are laws that explicitly discriminate against men that courts have upheld, or nobody, even some countries, I'm sure nobody has decided to sue because of fear of being ostracized by family and friends, by in their career, because of feminist capture of the culture, social norms, institutions, both public and private, in countries around the world. So, um, yeah, also some other discrimination for refugees. Refugees get fewer benefits who are male if they're in the European Union, especially if they're coming from Ukraine. And another form is the United Nations Food Program. Whenever there's a disaster where food aid is sent out to communities, like in Haiti after the earthquake there, women were given food first before men and boys, women and girls. So even an elderly woman would be given food, or even a fit woman would be given food for a young boy. I even saw like photos in line, I think it was in Pakistan, of boys waiting long before older women and girls for food. So even a boy child's life is considered less important than that of a grown woman who's already lived out her life, his own mother, his own grandmother. And they try to justify that by saying that the food is more equally distributed, which may have some truth. But if it's something as critical as survival and food aid, you need to be fair about it, as fair as possible. So a single father who has kids who he's raising should get food before a young woman who has no dependents. A young man who is thin and already looks malnourished should get food before a woman who is overweight or looks well nourished um, in a survival situation where people are starving. So things like that, like women and children first, survival situations. There's a lot of discrimination based on that when there's emergencies going on. Even UN Women advocated for rescuing women and girls first before men and boys. So even rescue a grandmother who's lived out her whole life, had her life experience, save her before a young boy. Like that's literally what they advocate for. Um, so yeah, when things turn into disaster too, men and boys are left behind just because they're male, not even considering whether they have dependents, how physically weak they are, whether they have disability, how young they are, how valuable their life is, how they can contribute to society. They're, in Gaza, the Gazan genocide, they always put women and girls first over men and boys. In statistics, they separated women and girls out as if men and boys don't matter. Even Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, is saying how Israel was killing the women of Palestine, women and children of Gaza, is as if the men don't matter, as if all the men were guilty for what happened on October 6th, when there are many men who didn't support that, many men who are paramedics, rescue workers who saved hundreds to thousands of lives of women, children, other men, good men out there in Gaza who are doing the right thing. And yet Emmanuel Macron and the international community don't care just because they're male, they're second class citizen, they're guilty because of the actions of other men. And yeah, you see that in a lot of areas. So yeah, I can go on and on with other examples, but those are some blatant areas: discrimination in retirement ages, workplace protections, judicial corporal punishment, and aid in disaster situations are some of the most blatant de facto and de jure case of discrimination against men, where men are explicitly discriminated against in policy and law, rather than just things like outcome and judicial bias, in which that's another thing, like women getting lower prison sentences than men for the same crime. So yeah, I mean, I could definitely cover some more of these things. Some things that also like to cover is bias against men in higher education, and some of my own experiences in that at my college and university, and just misandry that's been widespread in popular culture, online and music and entertainment and everyday life, social norms. There's a lot to cover, so I don't know if how you want to take it from there, Zarina. I think
Yeah,
I
that's
covered your deal.
you said a lot of really, really, really important stuff. So, yeah, so on judicial corporal punishment, that is banned in the UK. So it's a shame that's not illegal in the US, but in the UK that is illegal, because I was a bit shocked when you said that and I just looked that up. It's completely banned. I think that some of these malpractices should be banned in altogether. Like, I don't
Yeah.
think that anybody should be allowed to physically. I don't believe in hitting children. I don't
Yeah.
believe that anybody should be allowed to physically abuse anybody. I don't believe that people should be conscripted. I'm very against all of this stuff. I do have to say, so yeah, so I want to point this out. So a lot of what feminists tend to argue has been the patriarchal systemic oppression of women has
Yeah.
actually been more about, in many ways, giving women more, I don't want to say privileges, I will say protections, and at the expense of male suffering. And the position I would argue from that is that because of biological differences between men and women, because for most of human history, women had to bear children. There was no birth control, and people died much younger. So that's the reason why in most societies, men were expected to, protect, provide, to shoulder those burdens, while women had other burdens. And a lot of women died in childbirth, for example. So that's the view that I would take. And obviously, there have been societies where there were warrior women as well.
Yeah.
And the Birkenhead drill, women and children first as well. So yeah, I'm not a MRA, so I would push back slightly on that being, you know, like explicitly discrimination against men and more so necessity. And I think that
Mm.
feminists, their problem is that they look at that and say, oh well, that's male privilege. It's not really. The way I see it as someone from a gender equalist position is that it was more about the necessity of allowing men and women to have different roles. And obviously in the modern world, things have changed dramatically. And I
Mhm.
think as well, we need to take into other considerations, like you talked about your physical illness, mental illness, I think also needs to be accounted for. Like, I think anybody with an actual severely diagnosed mental illness, I don't know if they're allowed to serve in the military anyway, but like, I wouldn't be allowed to serve in the military, even if conscription for women were legal, I wouldn't be allowed to. If you have like actual, like, because it would just be no point.
Yeah.
So, there are some people, and I think in that context, it shouldn't discriminate against males or females. It should look at, the actual conditions. And yeah, that's very serious. What you
Mhm.
said about male refugees getting fewer benefits, and this is a very, very serious problem. And there's definitely a systemic bias towards more advocacy given to women and girls. Like, we hear it all the time. I mean, every time I'm with anybody and we
Yeah.
talk about anything, 95% of people, they'll say, oh yes, and for women it's hard, because especially for women, because it's
Yeah.
hard for women. And I find this very, very tiresome, because this is the problem. Our entire culture, I know you mainly talked about legal issues, but of course there's social de facto bias as well.
Yeah.
Anytime we want to talk about any problems concerning human beings, for example, domestic violence, oh
Yeah.
yeah, women are beaten up by their husbands. Of course they are. Men are also beating up by their wives and girlfriends. Or like the thing you said about, little boys not being given food. It's very, very sad. I would actually argue in that context we should prioritize children over anybody
Yeah.
else, because children, I would say children, the elderly, and actually vulnerable people. Um, it's very, very sick how a modern woman living in an affluent Western society, who doesn't have any like severely diagnosed illnesses, who has a job and an
Yeah.
education, how she can possibly claim victim status. And the sad thing is that those are most of the women who identify as feminists. Most of the feminists that I've known in my life have been very educated women, young women, a lot of them, a lot of my old friends, women who have gone to university, who don't really have anything to complain about apart from what somebody else might complain about. Like, for example, just like things that could be applied to anybody else. But I think the UK is overwhelmingly, and I suppose the same with the US, is overwhelmingly female, like really, really cares about female
Yeah.
safety, about females. And this is actually very problematic. And I think some of it does harken back to, chivalry. But also the thing is that in those times there was no feminism. It wasn't feminism because men were still appreciated and respected and
Yeah.
given honor and value. So it wasn't like there was the demeaning of the male role. And it was also, like feminists will now call it benevolent sexism, to care about
Yeah.
women and protects and provides for women. Feminists, this is like feminism gets very confusing actually, because one minute they're saying, you know, we need to care about women, but then if a man opens a door for a woman, oh, you're objectifying me. I am a free, independent woman. So they just contradict themselves all the time, which is why it's so ridiculously irrational to support feminism. I mean, it's just so exhausting.
Yeah. I can see that perspective. I do have some disagreements with you though, maybe on like, um, you know, in necessity. I think that anytime there's an emergency, things have to be fair as much as possible within the allotted time. So like a older person, an elderly woman's already lived out her life. A young man just starting out his life, should she get food before a young man? If especially whenever women can survive without food longer than men, because of biological reasons, men burn calories faster, etc. I think that we kind of have to question some of the general assumptions that, oh well, somebody who, women and elderly are inherently vulnerable. Whenever, I mean, really, you got to look at the details. Look at the nuances. Of course, children should obviously be prioritized first, and I think the younger you are, the more valued your life should be in those situations, and also how many dependents you have. If you have children to take care of, you should be more prioritized in those sort of emergency situations. But there's just so much to cover. I mean, even if something comes from some sort of patriarchy, benevolent sexism, it still benefits women more than men. It's still there, and many women still like that and benefit from it, and it still advantages them over men, such as in emergency situations, getting aid first, having your life valued more just because you're female. That's really not much different than valuing someone's life just because of their race more. Like, should you value the life of a Native American person more than that of a white person because of there's a lot more white Americans in the United States than there are Native Americans of certain tribes. It's like everybody's life should be valued based on things that make sense, not because of things they don't have any control over, is really the point I'm trying to make. And it seems like many of the ways feminists talk, they collectively blame all men, saying men need to get together and just fix their issues, when it's not that simple. It's a societal wide thing where women and men have both reinforced the social norms we have today, and that nobody chooses to be born male. Of course, like, it's just what we were born as, and you got to work with it and understand the male perspective if you're going to actually create long-term solutions for gender issues around the world. And it also helps women and girls too. So yeah, there's just so much to cover, that I don't know if I can get it all through within the hour, but I mean, I will, I do kind of want to move to bias against men in higher education and some of my own personal experiences in the workforce and internships in public education in the United States.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to ask one more question before we continue. So do you personally identify as a men's rights activist or advocate?
There's a lot of issues with that label, because using that label will get you canceled, and labeled a misogynist and sexist and all those things. And I have been on like some subreddits like r/men's rights, where I have noticed some where men get so angry over discrimination and bias that they notice that they actually make generalized statements about women and things that I think are misogynistic, and I've even pointed it out. I was even in this Discord called the Pro Mel Collective, where they pointed out whenever they try to generalize all women in a certain way, and I said that sounds kind of misogynistic to me, and they banned me from the group because I was just trying to moderate them a bit and say, hey, let's not generalize people. Let's treat people as individuals. So I by definition, I would probably identify one based on the definition, but based on how it's perceived, I don't. I'm just somebody who advocates for equality. I want to live in a world where you aren't treated or expected to act in a certain way just because you were born of a certain sex or race. That I don't have to be masculine I don't have to, you know, do this and that, be the protector and provider just because I'm born male. And I'm also a futurist, and I believe in transhumanism, which I found another men's rights activist who supports that, who's on your channel, Blue Orange 22, where, I think that we should have artificial wombs. That's one of the greatest burdens that women have that men don't, is that they have to carry a pregnancy for 9 months, and men don't have to do that. And if we had artificial human wombs, or we did human genetic engineering to where it wasn't just a woman who got pregnant and gave birth, that would eliminate a major inequality that causes all these issues. And eventually, if we could genetically engineer humans, it may take a long time, to where there are no biological sexes, or at least they're not apparent, and reproduction happened in a petri dish out of people's own choices rather than the animalistic desires we have now. That would change things a lot. So yeah, I'm a gender equalist. And I would call myself a men's and boys advocate, male egalitarian, but I am definitely not a male supremacist, and I am very much against misogyny. And I do think that there are some issues that women experience as well, such as no paid maternal leave in the United States. Um, Sometimes in a meeting, like I've noticed in groups in college, sometimes where men will dominate conversations and women won't get much of an opportunity to speak. So I've noticed the little nuances that women experience. But I think by and large, there's plenty of thousands of organizations and funding and groups everywhere on the local, regional, national, international levels for women and girls, and none for men and boys, even though men and boys, I think at least in the West, are struggling more across the board in many areas. And I mean, the higher suicide rate for men supports that. 75% of suicides are male. I think if, women had it worse off in so many areas in life, then it'd probably be the opposite. But even surveys show that men are less happy, less life satisfaction than women in the United States, by a certain degree. So yeah, I don't label myself as a men's rights activist just because of all the stigma around that label. And I think there are people in men's rights activist movement who aren't misogynists, who are gender egalitarians. But there's just so much stuff going on that people become resentful, and they say things that maybe go too far. But I also disagree with the labeling of feminist of all men's rights activists being misogynist. Like the book Men Who Hate Women, which puts men's rights activists, pickup artists, incels all in the same group, and they generalize and say all the manosphere is misogynist and they're all the patriarchy, whenever there are many legitimate issues, as I've mentioned before, where men and boys are discriminated against, both de jure in law and de facto in social norms, the biases of judges, and the bureaucracy of governments, of how they apply laws. So yeah, there's a lot to that. So yeah, that's what I am. But yeah, if we could talk about like bias against men in higher education, I'd like to cover some of
Please,
that.
yeah, definitely. Tell me about them. Bias against men in higher education.
Yeah, so I went to a university that was very female centered, very feminist, and I noticed discrimination against men almost from day one. Even whenever I first visited the campus, University of Missouri in Columbia, and it's not unique to that university, but based on an article I read from Forbes, it's especially female centric, and the whole city of Columbia, Missouri, is very gynocentric, ignores men's and boys issues. In addition, there's also the race aspect of that. I'm mestizo, Mexican American young man in a very predominantly white area, where even though people of my racial group are nearly about 15 to 20% of the United States population, in that area, less than 5%. And then even at Mizzou, like someone who's the same race and gender as me was like less than like 2.5% of the population. And I felt very marginalized there. And I did make friends. There are good people there for sure. And initially, I focused on the race stuff, racial disparities. especially in 2020, because I started college in 2018, and I stayed there longer than I should have because of COVID, and I left for a year. Um, and I know I initially tried to direct towards, oh well, white women get a lot more advantages than black and brown men, especially those from the historically marginalized groups, native people descended from indigenous peoples of the Americas and people descended from African slaves. Foundational black Americans are the most marginalized groups of people in America, compared to white and Asian people. And I focused heavily on that because I knew that men's issues has more of a stigma, that they wouldn't rule with that. I'd be labeled, a men's rights activist and be canceled for it. So I focused a lot on race and ethnicity, and those are important. But looking back, I should have been more for men's issues, and I did. To some degree, I did make Title IX reports against my university, which is a law that is supposed to guarantee equality in universities based on sex, for women-only programs. My college had a women's center, only for women to study with women's programs in there, nothing for men, even though nearly 60% of enrollees, undergraduates, were women. And then even higher, like over 60% among the graduate enrollment rate. Men were doing worse off, and by an increasing degree, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic, in enrollment, in graduation rates, in academic success and average GPA by a significant amount, and even in income of the first job after graduation. And they had all these programs only for women everywhere, even some that explicitly discriminated against men. For example, within different colleges, like different departments, like the business department, but also across the university. And even there were a lot of women-only clubs, and hardly anything for men. I felt very unwelcomed as a man there, and I definitely wasn't the only one, but I was more willing to say something about it just because my whole life, I've always been more observant than probably a lot of men, of anti-male bias. A lot of men don't want to speak up because they fear they might not be able to date or get a girlfriend or whatever because, speaking up for men's issues, they will be ostracized because there's so much control in every level, socially, institutionally, bureaucratically, at a campus like that, and many campuses across the country, of feminist capture, that if you even bring up men's issues, you might get canceled. You'll be labeled a misogynist. You'll be labeled a sexist. I did warn professors, like, hey, this program discriminates against men, such as this WinVent program at my business school, where they were going to provide funding for a group of people, and it had who created like some new technology or business idea. And it was only for a group that was led by a woman. Technically, they tried to skirt through it by saying men could be included as long as the leader was a woman. But that made me think, like, wow, I mean, that group would probably be men doing most of the work, maybe, perhaps, and then they would have a female leader just to get into the group, maybe taking credit for the men's work. That's definitely a situation. But like having funding only for women but not for men, like just treat people equally, and they're not even accounting for like other factors that are more important in terms of disparities, like race and ethnicity and socioeconomic background, and being in a foster home when you're growing up, child abuse, childhood trauma, disability, neurodivergency. They ignore those factors that are much more relevant than gender, especially when women are doing better off than men in all those areas. um, you know they have a committee on the status of women, and a special award they give out every year to someone who increases the rights or status of women, even though women were doing better off than men in every area, and men were the ones who were enrolling at that University of Missouri, less and less every year, and lower graduation rates, lower attendance of classes, just falling behind in every area compared to women. And yet all of their programs and advocacy were only for women. And it's even worse whenever, like I said, you factor in socioeconomic background and race. Like a privileged white woman from a wealthy family who has alumni parents, whose parents went to the university, and she's a legacy student. In the United States, you can get scholarships and preferential admission just because you're the child or grandchild of a alumni person. But that woman would get way more help than a, marginalized man of color, mestizo, Native American, African American man who comes from a poor family and didn't had parents who didn't go to college. That privileged white woman would get more help. Even like there's this program at my university that I reported them for in the Title IX office, where they had an alumni mentoring program only for women, where they connected alumni to current students for mentorship. And they didn't have any gender neutral program. They did, but they got rid of it, and they were left with the Griffiths Leadership Society. And that was run by the university, a public university paid by taxpayer money, both by men and women. They only had mentorship program for women. And I saw like a white woman from Europe who was an international student was in that program. And yet I don't get anything, even though, I'm from a working class background. Only my father has a college degree. And I come from a somewhat rural area. And I was very marginalized racially and even class-wise based on my socioeconomic background being working class. I don't get a mentorship program, even though statistically I'm far less represented, far more marginalized than a person who's not even a U.S. citizen who's getting this program that's taxpayer funded more help than I am. Like, that's just ridiculous to me on so many levels. And, it made me very resentful and very angry while I was there, because I just noticed anti-male discrimination, woman-only stuff everywhere. And there was no place for you as a man. There were no men's-only clubs, plenty for women-only. Even in areas where women were dominating, like the journalism school, they had a summer program only for women, none for men. I could go on and on about this, but and they had scholarships only for women, women retreats, just nothing for men. And part of it's because men didn't advocate for themselves because they've been taught that they're the privileged sex, that anything that's male only is weird or sexist. And if you call anything out about it, you must be some incel. And they just label these insults and generalize and these mean, nasty generalizations. I see them online too, of anyone who advocates for men. And things really need to change. I think things are starting to change, but misandry, the word has become mainstream, but there are more men online, I notice, and even in real life, who are noticing just how fucked up things are. Sorry for the language, but just how stacked against men society is in so many ways, in so many levels, and how feminists just always try to use some sort of mental gymnastics or backtrack or use all this manipulation to try to say, oh, we're really the victims. It's really women who are worse off. Whenever all these statistics, all of these things I've observed in real life, online, doing my own research, just points to other things. And the fact is, it's also hard to find men's issues research, men's rights research, because there's these women's studies at universities and colleges that are basically activist researchers who are feminists, and there's no men's studies program. So a lot of the research information out there on the internet on research academic papers is only from the feminist perspective. And though, if anything points out to disparity against men, they'll try to undermine it or belittle it. So we're even at a loss for research. Thankfully, some things have changed with the American Institute for Boys and Men being created, but it's not nearly enough, not even close. And it's no wonder a lot of young men are resentful and angry these days of all of the biases against us and just all the bullshit excuses that feminists come up with to belittle, dismiss, make fun of, mock any man who brings up men's issues and the issues as a whole when they're posted on social media, social isolation, etc. The male loneliness epidemic, a lot of people make that out about men being single, not having relationships, romantic relationships, sexual relationships. I think it's more about men being socially isolated, not having friendships, than anything. Because of the internet and how men are taught, how homophobia against men, any closeness between two men, even if it's platonic, has the stigma of being perceived as gay. So a lot of men not networking, developing the strong friendships women do. Of course, male friendships will probably always be a bit different than female friendships, but men really do need those close friendships, even if they do have a romantic partner. You shouldn't rely on your girlfriend or boyfriend or wife or husband to be the only source of social support. And there's a lot of misandry and just going on these days, that extends from the college campus, and it goes on through workplaces, nonprofit organizations, musicians like Sabrina Carpenter saying really hateful, misandrous stuff that would get her canceled if she was a man, quite frankly. And I intersect my other experiences based on race and socioeconomic background, and that just makes me more resentful whenever I see a poor man of color like these undocumented, though hardworking or even documented mestizo employees, African American employees who are working, building roofs, doing the unpleasant jobs, working class jobs, working their butts off, extremely underrepresented in colleges, universities like University of Missouri. And yet all of these programs are only for these more privileged white and Asian women who are very overrepresented. The most overrepresented groups, white and Asian women, get the most resources and help in universities and colleges, while the least represented groups, Native American, mestizo, African American men, get little to no help. And I just see them working their butts off, providing the support, construction work, roofing, plumbing, janitors, a lot of janitors working overnight shifts, being underpaid. And they're ignored. And it's like, really? Are you kidding me? Like, you think these privileged white women are the ones who are marginalized from wealthy families, upper middle class families, not the poor marginalized men of color, even white men who are poor too, who come from trailer homes and rural areas. It's really like the reality of things is like completely out of sync with what things should be, with this facts and statistics. It's like I'm living in some sort of delusion whenever I went to that university. So yeah, as to how things are changing, like I said before, I think more men are being aware of how to organize that. It's going to be hard because men tend to compete against each other. I think they're less cooperative and supportive of each other than women are among each other, less likely to advocate for each other. But I do see a growing movement of criticizing feminist dogma, of pointing out the struggles that men and boys face. And there will always be mean-spirited feminists who try to belittle it. And they're not just feminists, they're misandrists who try to belittle the male suicide rate, male loneliness, male socioeconomic background, just say, oh, you're pathetic, and so men deserve this for the past, as if, how are men living now guilty for the things of what other people do? We're all individuals. Should white people be punished for what happened in the past, slavery, genocide of Native Americans? Of course not. Of course not. So, they're just so illogical. And yeah, I hope things change. I think things are slowly getting for the better. And I think it's a good thing that many people who call themselves feminists are calling themselves misandrists and spewing hateful content online, because it exposes who they really are. They're no longer hiding it. They're really pushing it out there. And just treat people as individuals, and nobody chooses to be born male is the core things that people need to know. And think about your own biases before judging a man. Like, judging a man for being emotional, for crying, for advocating for himself. Like, a lot of women these days might view that as pathetic or whatever. And it's like, we're all human, we all have emotions, and men have every right to express their emotions and concerns as much as women do. So yeah, I know we're getting to the end here. So I guess there may be, another thing to cover, like explicit misandry in pop culture, and entertainment and double standards. But yeah, that's kind of my personal story of things I've noticed, and it's led me to where I am now, where I'm not afraid to go out on a podcast and speak this stuff up, because it's become so obvious to me and so blatant that I have to say something, just as a rational person who believes in fairness and equality. So don't know where to go off from there. Sorry, that was
Yeah,
a
I'm
lot.
very glad that you've come on today and said all this. To me, it's very, very sad. And I
Yeah.
think that it's very important. So I guess I'd like to close up by asking, what actions can men take to improve life for themselves?
Yeah. Yep. I see a lot of men online ranting, sort of like I kind of did a little bit about issues, and there's no action. But what needs to happen is like maybe forming a meetup groups, forming Discord groups with local people you know in real life, and making a men's group in your workplace, forming a men's affinity group, and reporting discrimination against men in workplaces. If there's women only affinity groups but nothing for men, report that to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in the United States, and have more empathy for other men. Just because you're emotionally close to another man doesn't mean that's romantic or gay or whatever. You know, men can have close friendships, emotional friendships where they're not just, you know, making dumb jokes or making, you know, insults to each other, or just, you know, looking at something and not looking at each other, like playing golf, playing video games, like actually talking to each other, and um, getting to know each other and their emotional struggles and trauma is really necessary. And, you know, stop. A lot of men are afraid because they think they might not get a date or whatever. Like, you should prioritize what's right and good as a human being rather than your own desire for a romantic, intimate relationship. That's very animalistic, you know. Like, to be a, you know, a wise and rational human is to prioritize society as a whole and what's truly fair rather than just focusing on your own narrow self-interest, even whenever like all the discrimination against men negatively affects men. you know um Focus on quality for everybody rather than your own narrow self-interest, such as wanting intimacy or a romantic partner. That matters less than equality. And point out misandry when you see it online in real life. Call it out. Um, make like the comparisons I make. Like, what if somebody said this based on a race? Like, a lot of misandrous online feminists will say how make generalizations, bigoted accusations about men. It's like, what if you apply that to a certain racial group, or all straight people, or all gay people, or all people with certain skin color? It's no different. It really isn't, because nobody chooses their sex or race or whatever. Men with disabilities exist who are vulnerable. So network with each other, support each other, break through your inhibition, your biases, question things, question why things are the way they are. You know, why society has to be so gynocentric, why it has to be ladies first. Even like, you know, free drinks for women at bars, that's still discriminatory. Like, why do we do that, you know? And speak out, you know, don't be afraid to speak up. And I think things will eventually change. Report discrimination, call it out, stand by what you believe in, even if there's some risk to your career, your social life. There has to be change somewhere, and things will never. It'll start affecting everybody, all men, until men start advocating for each other. Because it's like, you know, the discrimination keeps growing and growing in a certain group in a certain country, to where people don't do anything about it or say anything about it until it affects them directly, and then they get all mad about it. And I've seen this a lot among in men's communities, where like a man will get divorced and lose custody of his children, and it's not only until that point where it affects him directly that he gets into men's issues and men's rights and men's equality, and for boys as well. Um, yeah, so we gotta push back and advocate for ourselves and stop putting, you know, intimacy with women and having romantic relationship on some sort of pedestal and getting female attention. Advocate for
Sure. I
yourself,
mean,
you know?
you know,
Yeah.
there are a lot of benefits as well to pursuing romantic relationships that aren't necessarily self-interested. Like, one can argue that having
Yeah.
a partner is good for keeping society stable and mutual obligations and children. But I
Yeah.
understand what you're saying in that, you know, yes, it's not good to make, you know, the obsession with having a partner at the forefront of your life. Like
Exactly.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that kind of
And
sense.
that's why
Okay,
many men
cool.
are afraid to speak up, because they think they might
Yeah,
not get a
right,
partner if they speak up. So,
right.
of course, there's good women out there, good men out there who are empathetic to men's issues. So it's not like everybody is, you know, some rabid, radical, man-hating feminist. You know. So,
Of course, yeah.
um,
Okay, so one last question then. Can you recommend any books out there for people to read on this topic?
Yeah, I just came up with a list of books from my Amazon
Sure,
list.
just say them and I'll write them in the chat.
Yeah, it's The Myth of Male Power by Dr. Warren Farrell. That's a classic.
Book.
The Boy Crisis by Warren Farrell. The War Against Boys by Christina Hoff Sommers. Men on Strike by Helen Smith.
Sorry, one second, because I want to put these in the chat.
Oh, sorry.
It's very important. Yeah. No, I've
There's
so I've
only
read yeah, The Myth of Male Power. I have The Boy Crisis. What did you say, the one by Christine Hoff Sommers?
The
Is it
War
War
Against
of
Boys.
Boys?
Yep. There's only about 10 of them here that I'll mention.
Okay.
Men on Strike by Helen Smith.
Okay.
And then Of Boys and Men by Richard Reeves, which is a bit more mainstream. Richard
Okay,
Reeves
that's
really
perfect.
got things, got the men's issues, men's and boys advocacy mainstream. Although he's more soft and more catering towards, the feminist points of patriarchy, which I disagree with.
Okay.
The Second Sexism, which explores like explicit discrimination against men, like a lot of the ones I've mentioned, like retirement ages, conscription in the
Who's
military.
that by?
David Benatar. It's Benatar. He's a South African professor. And then two more. Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Men.
Sorry,
No,
can you repeat that, please?
sorry, that's a mouthful. Yeah, the Convention on the
Convention is in convention.
Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination
Mm-hmm.
Against Men.
Cool. And
And
that is by
that's by Carl Augustson. It's like the month August with
that's brilliant. Cool.
yep. He's a part of the National Coalition for Men, and he's a professor too. He has Georgian citizenship and American citizenship, so he's really all about international discrimination against men, especially by a UN woman, which is a very biased, I would even say misandrous organization. So he covers all the laws and policies worldwide that discriminate against men. Well, not all of them, but many of them. And then the last set of books is a trilogy, or you could say 3-book series called, the first book is Legalizing Misandry.
I've heard of that. I've heard of quite a few of these, yeah.
Yeah, Spreading Misandry is the sequel, and then Replacing Misandry. And that's by two Canadian authors. One's a man, one's a woman. Paul Nathanson and Catherine Young, spelled with a K.
I just put one of them. Who is the first one? Sorry, Paul.
Paul Nathanson, Nathan, and then Son.
Cool.
Okay. Yeah, and I think those are like some core books that really point out the reality that men and boys live in. There's a lot more, but if you look on Amazon, if you know where to look, you can definitely find a lot of good information out there.
Okay, so I'm just gonna leave this on the screen, just so people can see this. There was quite a lot, so I split it up into. But
Yeah.
yeah, The Myth of Male Power is a fantastic book. I've got a list of anti-feminist literature that includes some of these. I have The Boy Crisis. It's a fat book. I haven't actually read it, but yeah, I've definitely added some of these to that list already. So I think one of them on like legalizing misandry, definitely Christina Hoff Sommers. Yeah. But no, honestly, thank you so much, Andrew. This has been a very, very deeply impassioned and very, very important stream. I'm very glad to have had you on here today. And I think that, you know, as you said, we just need to keep speaking up about issues facing men and boys so it becomes
Yeah.
as mainstream as talking about, So I think a lot of men as well, they have, even if they're not necessarily feminists, they have an implicit bias towards women in the sense that they say, oh, yeah, and it was hard for women. Oh, it was hard for women. And, we should think about everybody. Absolutely.
Yeah, I appreciate you giving the time to regular people like me who may not have a PhD or influencers online. As for the audience, I don't have a personal brand quite yet, but I'm hoping to start a Substack and maybe later on a YouTube channel about men's issues. But I'm just taking some time in my life to study and set up my career. But as things go along, I'll definitely share a lot more. Appreciate the time, and I will definitely be watching more of your live streams, Irina, and hope your channel will continue to succeed.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Substack is amazing. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for tuning in today. And we will be live again on Tuesday with Steve Brule. I'm not sure if it's pronounced Brule or Brule, but yeah, thank you, everybody. This is The Rational Female. Thank you, Andrew, and goodbye.
All right. Good day.